So thank you very much for coming out tonight. And the first question is, what's a valuable story or account about someone that you've accompanied that you'd be able to share with us?
Could you speak a little louder, please?
I apologize. I don't speak past this point, so thank you.
Well, I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. As I think about the many people that I've accompanied towards end of life as I work in palliative care, there are many stories I could share, but there is one in particular that stands out for me. She was a young woman who was diagnosed with cancer at an age when most people would not be having to think about those things in her life. And she was initially, after treatment, given a clean bill of health, and so was ecstatic and was able to resume many of her activities. And then, unfortunately, within about 6 months, had been had a recurrence, and was told essentially that it was not a curable cancer. And so when I met her, she really struggled. She struggled a lot with trying to make sense of why would this be happening now. Why was it happening to her? What did it mean in terms of her family and what impact it would have on them? And so a lot of the time that I spent with her, and she has given me permission to share that, is that she really struggled with trying to make sense of life, with trying to come to terms, I guess, if you ever can. And she had this image of, it was an image of pushing. She felt like she was always pushing against a current. And throughout our conversations, as she continued to try and explore what this meant to her and the fears around it, many of her, the losses she was experiencing, she came to a point where that image changed for her, and she was no longer feeling like she had to push against the current. It was more an opportunity to go with the current and to find a way to make sense of what was a very meaningless time or senseless time, you know, in terms of how to understand what was happening. And it was through that experience, I think, that she spent much quality time with her family and her friends, and died a very peaceful death. And it was a year later that I had the opportunity to reconnect with her family. It was actually a gift that had been left for me at work one day, and I opened it up, and it was a teacup. She'd been a collector of teacups throughout her early life, and it was kind of coincidental in that one day when one of her family members was in my office. He had noticed that I also had a teacup that I collected and asked me about it, and a year later he thought it would be a very fitting gift to give me as a remembrance and acknowledgement of the time that I spent with her. So I have that as a lasting memory and story of her life.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Armstrong?
It's difficult to talk about. My wife's a veterinarian, and for years I've often thought that we're sometimes more humane with animals than we are with people as they reach the end of their lives. And I have yet to be asked to be part of the most recent legal precedent where we're allowed to hasten people's death. And so to date, that has not happened to me. A few years back, I was working in a hospice, and a fellow was there, and he didn't have a lot of pain. He'd been there for a while. He had lots of visitors. He was very with it. He celebrated with his family's birthday. He had a big celebration. All his family came in, and his friends came in. And then afterwards, he said to me, "I'm ready. I don't want to suffer anymore. I'm ready to be at the end." And so what happened at that point is we sedated him. We didn't kill him. And his family were there for the last little while, and he passed on several days later. But he was quite ready for the end at that time. I've had other experiences with people who have not been ready, and everybody's different. There was one fellow, when I was trying to help him to be ready, he had stage 4 cancer, and he'd been to the cross and been told there was no treatment. And so I encouraged him to perhaps get his will in order and make his peace with his family and his friends. And he stopped seeing me. He saw somebody else. And about 6 months later, I saw that he was in the hospital, and I went in to visit him. And I said hello to him. He thanked me. and he said that he was going to beat this. He was going to go down to Mexico and get some special treatments down there, and he was going to beat this. And a week later, he was dead. Without reaching that point of acceptance, without reaching that point of being ready, he fought it all the way, and he didn't win. And so I was happy to hear your story about how people realize that they are no longer fighting the flow and can go with the flow. And I'll pass it on to Sue.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Reverend?
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me today. Mark, your story reminds me of one that I was thinking of, and I have walked with many people in their last days of life, and I would say at least 95% of those journeys are ones where people go with the flow and are able to come to a place where they understand and accept that they are dying. But the one that sticks out for me is you asked for a valuable story. All of these stories are valuable, but one that for me was valuable was similar to Mark's, and it was a young man in a church that I was working in. He was in his early 40s, and one day fell down his stairs and was paralyzed. And he had brain cancer, and it was very aggressive, and he had 3 small children. And they were a very wealthy family, and he too thought that he would beat this cancer and that he would win. And there was no speaking with his children about the fact that he was very ill, and they kept thinking he was going to get better and he was going to get better. And it came very close to the end of his life, and still he was determined. And I can still remember going to his house. He wasn't there anymore. He was in the hospital, and they were building an elevator. They were building a huge elevator up this 3-story house, and they still thought he was coming back to live in this elevator. And that elevator symbolized for me an inability to accept what was to happen. As the days came very close to the end of his life, they sent his 3 children away to the cottage. And the 3 children were at the cottage the day that their dad died, and were brought back, having not experienced what would have been a very difficult thing, but which was more difficult because they were not there when their dad died. And we did, as Mark talked about, try to speak with this man about allowing a space by which you fight until you can fight no longer, but then you do come to a point where you're able to accept that this is what will happen. And then you work very hard to help the rest of your family. And there's a hard piece of dying. And another friend who was 40 who died, and he had 3 kids. And I remember him, and he was a firefighter, and he worked with his kids and his wife to prepare them for what was to happen. And so we all journey this differently, and there's certainly no judgment, but in terms of stories with value, as we work with people to help them come to a place of peacefulness in that journey. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Leier?
I live with a palliative care nurse, so I hear about people dying every day and how they die, and certainly see a lot of people at the end of their lives, both adults and children, in the hospitals that I work at. But I also teach these people as well, and I found that my personal experience is that the dying people and their families, because of the culture that we live in, which has been described as the philosopher Ivan Illich describes it as a culture where we've medicalized death. I find that our attitudes towards death are incredibly inauthentic and sometimes alien, so it doesn't surprise me ever that people have difficulty with the concept and difficulty communicating about it. And so to facilitate that, I always used a little Tolstoy novella called The Death of Ivan Illich as a bit of narrative to help teach young physicians and young nurses to understand what are some of the underlying dynamics. And the story, even though it's over 100 years old now, is probably as accurate an assessment you can get about sort of dysfunctional dynamics and around death and dying. So I encourage you all to read it. It's a phenomenal little piece of work. But I guess in terms of good stories, I think anecdotes can sometimes steer us in funny ways, but one of the themes that comes through is that we are bad at talking about dying, and we are bad at, some people say, almost pathologize to when we live with people or know people who are dying, to almost try and steer their attention away from that. And oftentimes, that's what people who are sick and who are dying need to actually talk about, or to be listened to. And so I think that's one of the skills that you sort of need to bring to the table in the rare but inevitable circumstance when you find yourself in people who are critically ill or even unexpectedly ill, just listening to them. Sometimes family aren't even the best people because they're too close, and those dynamics, whether they're loving families or dysfunctional families or a combination of both, like all of ours, those tend to be amplified. But sick people need, I think, to be listened to and not managed and not appeased and not misdirected. But anxieties that we have over life itself all manifest themselves in different ways. And part of being a compassionate caregiver, I think, is just being able to listen to people and understand that sometimes, even if you are a health professional or a family member, that you can care for people in very straightforward and simple ways. But first, you have to listen to what they need and what they desire, and that's one of the difficult aspects about the whole phenomenon of assisted death for me is that sometimes the conversation stops with, well, I want to die, and I think there's a lot in the articulation of a statement like that we really need to unpack to be careful and attentive.
Thank you very much. The second question for the panel is, in the film Hold Me, Hannah struggles with talking about her grief. What advice would you offer people struggling with grief or expressing their emotions at the end of life?
I think all of us have experienced loss in one or more ways, and the experience often accompanying loss is grief, and it's a very normal response to significant losses in our lives. But I think perhaps the biggest challenge for many of us is being able to express it in healthy ways. Partly, I think it's because of the lack of maybe support and understanding of what it's like to be grieving. Perhaps it's our own discomfort with what that is like. But I think generally it's important to recognize that it is a normal response that we all have, and finding ways that will be effective in expressing it. I think, too, there's certain misconceptions about how we should grieve. And perhaps for Hannah, though I don't know what her experience of grief had been like before, if it's not modeled in a way that is very healthy, or if it's modeled in a certain way of how we grieve, it can be difficult for us to perhaps express it. There is no one right way to grieve. And there are many, I think, ways of grieving that can be very healthy that don't necessarily involve talking. I think sometimes we think we have to connect with someone and be, and I think it is very important and can be very helpful, and particularly for some people having a professional who can be there. But there are other ways for us to express those feelings. And to also realize that feelings are not bad or good. I think we sometimes have a way of not necessarily dichotomizing them, but judging our feelings. There are certain feelings we feel comfortable with expressing, and other feelings we don't. Feelings just are. They're a part of who we are. And it's okay to express them in different ways. And for some, it will be through conversation. It will be through connecting with others. For other people, it might be through the creative arts, or maybe it'll be through some physical activity. There's a wonderful example of a program being offered here in Edmonton about using yoga for grief as one example, but there are many others that I can certainly think of. And we know that some people are more likely, for example, to be what we call intuitive grievers, people who tend to express themselves more emotionally, whereas others may be what we call instrumental grievers, people who need to do things to grieve. And so building special monument for someone to remember someone by. Whereas I remember one person who handcrafted a wonderful box for someone who's being cremated and created that himself as a way to be grieving and doing at the same time. So I think for anyone, it's being able to find what works for you and what fits for you, and recognizing that there isn't necessarily a right way, and that as long as you find healthy ways for expressing, I think that's most important.
Thank you. Dr. Armstrong?
Thank you for your insight. What I have done is encourage people, give them permission to cry. Quite often people are uncomfortable with shedding tears and expressing grief, and I try to give them permission. And if they have children, they're quite often not willing to grieve around their children. And I tell them that you're modeling this for your children, and they're going to watch you, and I think it's healthy to hold everything in and not express it. And so I would encourage parents to not be afraid to let their children see that they're crying or tearful.
Thank you. Reverend?
It depends on age group. I've worked with quite a few teenagers who have lost friends. I used to live in a very remote northern community, and so there was quite a lot of grief in that community and a lot of death. And so for teenagers who may grieve differently with their friends, often with their peers, we talked about writing a letter to the person who has died. We had people put those in caskets as we prepared for young people to be buried. Mementos that would be put there, getting together to talk. And so talking, writing letters, something concrete. Again, when I lived in the north, everything, it was always a body was buried, and so the grave would need to be dug. And in fact, I found that an incredibly wonderful way for people to grieve, especially for men to grieve, because that, again, crying, not a big thing to do, right? And so, when someone died in Fort McPherson, the family was responsible for preparing the grave, and they would dig it 6 feet down, regardless of what temperature it was, even in the middle of winter, in the dead of winter. They would jackhammer, they would get heaters out to try and heat the ground, and sometimes it took up to 4 days. But you would go there and be able to do something and be with this family as they grieved. And for one family in particular, I can remember he was a hockey player and he had committed suicide, and the family was not very functional, and so there was no one in that young man's immediate family who could go and get that grave dug. But the hockey team spent the next 4 days digging that grave. And I remember I was from Toronto at the time, and I remember going and asking them if they needed anything, and they looked at me like, what are you going to offer to this process that we're involved in right now? And not a lot at that point. Anyway, they grieved through doing. And finally, another way that I have encouraged people to grieve is through continuing to do something that was important in the life of the person that you lost. And so if your mom was involved in raising money for cancer, or in running that breast cancer run, then you continue to do that in her memory. Or if she loved to quilt, or whatever else became an important thing for them, that as we do that thing in memory of that loved one, it is part of our grieving. And prayer, finally, would be something that I would encourage people to do, and not just praying nice, fancy, proper prayers, but praying anguish and anger, and looking at the Psalms, which are full of anger and anguish, and not being afraid of yelling at God or questioning God, or just being angry. So encouraging prayer as well.
Thank you. Dr. Leier?
Yeah, I think that, again, this is an interesting question, and I love the idea of digging a grave. I'm not sure I could pull it off in my backyard. Yeah, I'm just contemplating that. I think, again, grief. One of the things that I really loved about that film was, and I loved it because it resonated with me, and I think probably because the women that I've dated over my life, and certainly my wife, have suffered me, and then their response oftentimes, which was great, was, "What's wrong with you?" "I'm fine, I'm fine." So she must have said, "I'm fine." I don't know, do you ever count it in the script? 70 times? So I love that. Yeah, I love that, right? And it's such a It's such a nice colloquial defense mechanism. I guess an element from my personal life, I went through some really difficult times a couple of years ago, and being a bit more of a narcissist, instead of saying I'm fine, when people would ask me how I was doing, I would just say, terrible. It's been the worst week of my life. And it's great to see their faces then, if they're standing on the elevator. Oh my God, what the hell did I just say? I have to learn new greetings and ways to not involve myself in these situations. And then there are the rare people that say, whoa, what's going on? How can I help you? And some of the best conversations of my life ever came out of something like that. Being honest and not having to protect people around you by having a facade, because underneath it all, human beings are as social animals, are so emotionally intuitive that when people say that they're fine to you, then, very rarely they may be fine. But if you intuit something that's going on, like Hannah's mom, for instance, that does nothing to say that you're fine, right? And it's not being honest with them. And I find that doesn't mean that your family needs to be, or people around you need to be immersed by a grieving person, and maybe the misery that is associated with that. But I think as you grieve too, you need to sort of adopt the art of brooding properly, and actually finding some meaningful articulation of that, whether it's the practice of yoga or something like that. I saw a picture of myself from a couple of years ago, and it was my friend and I jacking the engine out of my Subaru. And I looked at him like, what in the hell did you do that for? And it was in the middle of that time. So I sort of, mostly necessary, but kind of unnecessarily took the motor out of my car and took it apart and put it back together and put it back in my car as a sort of source of brooding, where I could be alone in the garage, and only if I was injured could people come out and see me and talk to me. But it was a process of working through the stuff that I was going through without unnecessarily exposing myself and my brooding self to my family, and being able to go away, but still do something that wasn't watching television. I think grief is very much like that, because you can't escape it. It's not something you get over. And there's a great comedian named Patton Oswalt, whose wife died a couple of years ago. And it's remarkable to hear him as a comic kind of make jokes about grief and about how grief sneaks up on him and takes him by surprise. And it's so tragically sad but funny at the same time to listen to him reflect and talk about this, that I think you need to have the capacity to be honest with people and ask them honestly how they're doing and pay attention to them and listen to them, but also being able to say, I'm terrible, and maybe I'll never get better, but I have to go take the motor out of my Subaru.
Thank you. So for the third question, how do you manage the emotional toll that working with the dying can bring?
It's an excellent question. I think that anyone working in this area at least struggles with or thinks about it at some point along their career. I think we're all we come to this place of work, I think, through many different paths, and for each of us there can be gifts and benefits to caring, but there can also be costs. And some of those costs, I think, are less obvious than others. Hannah talked about, too, I think, that sense of initially she was scared to be around people who were really ill, and then over time, or holding someone at the end of life, and then over time she became more comfortable and more able to be there, being there in the present moment. But there was an emotional side and emotional cost to it. And for myself, I think I look for the early warning signs. I look for the things that are changing in my own self, my own body, my own way of being in the world that says, I need to take some time for myself now. And it can be the simple thing like I'm getting up in the morning and feeling really tired, Or maybe I'm saying, I really think this might be a day I wish I didn't have to go to work. Or maybe it's a day when I might be a little more irritable with someone. Or maybe I've said things that weren't quite the way I would have liked to have said them. And so I look for those signs that then help me to say, what do I need to do to take care of myself right now? Part of it, I think, generally is in the work that I do, it's maintaining healthy boundaries. It's having a good balance between work and home and other parts of my life. It's recognizing that I cannot be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The need is very high, and there are other people who can replace me. I'm not irreplaceable. And it's also recognizing when I've had some experience at work that sort of affected me in some way, to reflect on that and think about, what was that about? What is happening inside for me that's saying maybe I need to reconsider how things are going in my work. The whole area of self-care is extremely important. We hear a lot about wellness now in the workplace. And so a lot of it has to do with self-care strategies, things that I do outside of work, but also things that I do at work. And outside of work, I do a lot of, I'm very interested in have a passion for music and play the piano. I'm interested in photography and writing, a lot of the creative arts. My husband and I do a lot of wonderful things together, physically in terms of cycling and cross-country skiing, things that can keep me kind of balanced in life. But at work, I also need to be thinking about some of these things too. And so it's taking the moments away from the busyness of the unit that I work on so that I can catch my breath. Or it's feeling like if I'm really having a tough day, there's maybe a colleague that I can stop and talk to and maybe just check in and see how things are going or help me reframe what's happening. Or maybe it's taking that deep breath before I walk into a room, recognizing that I have no idea how this is going to work, what's going to happen in our conversation, but recognizing
to call them and talk more candidly about how things are going. So that is one strategy. Taking the dog for a walk is another. Playing with the kids when I get home from work. And then also just recognizing that sometimes you're not going to take care of yourself, and sometimes you're just a mess, and 3 people have died, and you are just so heartbroken that it's going to suck for a while. And it is going to suck for a while. But you're going to be okay eventually. And I'm sorry, Steve, that it sucks for a while occasionally, who is my spouse. But yeah, it is hard, and yeah, it's you're a mess sometimes.
Thank you. Dr. Leier?
It's funny to hear people who are in healthcare talk about self-care, because it is a real focus in healthcare, especially in education and things like that. And then they're always the first people just to throw it out the window, right? It's amazing, right? You get some stress in your life, and then you stop exercising, and then it's just like almost like a cascade downhill. I think from my perspective. I've always really admired seeing people in healthcare who've done their job for a long time, and people who you admire the job that they do when they've done it for a long time. And a number of those people in my hospital are actually in palliative care. When I first started training, I thought that is the last thing you want to be able to do for your entire career. Certainly, it must be, do it for a couple of years, and they must get rid of these people very quickly. But it was so interesting to me to learn that that's really not the case, and that some of the people I've known that have had the longest careers stay in palliative care, and those units typically don't have a very high turnover, and so there's something. It made me think a lot about really the outcomes of your interventions. And in palliative care, you're not saving people's lives, so that's not the outcome you're looking for, but there is a great opportunity to actually just sort of manifest these natural inclinations that we have as social animals, and compassion is one of the deepest ones that's most really inherent to us as human beings that we learn through our lives to mitigate to some extent, I think, unfortunately. But if you just understand that as the feeling of the suffering of another person, being motivated to alleviate that suffering. If you find yourself in that role, having a fulfilling and compassionate relationship with someone who's a patient or a friend or a family member is one of the most fulfilling experiences you can have as a human being. But in those situations, I think that the things that I am concerned about, especially in the workplace, because I work so closely with clinicians, is finding yourself in a situation where you do feel the suffering of other people, but you can't alleviate that suffering, or at least if you're compelled to, something's preventing you from doing that. And so there is this phenomenon in healthcare called moral distress when you find yourself in situations like that. And I've seen that in some family structures as well. And so I think if I would have one note about self-care, it's paying attention to the environment that you're providing care in. And if you are exposed to the suffering of other people, you should have you should have a clear path to being able to alleviate that suffering. And I think that's where wisdom comes in as well, because we all don't know what it would look like to alleviate someone's suffering or how exactly to do that. And so I think those two things both certainly go hand in hand. And I think that oftentimes the sort of world weariness that we feel sometimes is through the sort of vicariousness of our exposure to suffering. You look on Facebook or listen to the news and you hear about terrible things happen in the world that you can't do anything about. It's very unnatural, and I think it's overwhelming. So I think we do need, as human beings, to avail ourselves of those opportunities to have that satiated emotion, to be around suffering people, but to be able to help them, or at least learn how to help them, or think about how to help them. And I think that experience is just ultimately rewarding in and of itself, and absolutely essential to us as human beings. So we need to pick and choose those experiences and seek them out, and avoid the ones where we are exposed to suffering but really can't do anything about unnecessarily.
Thank you. The next question is, what do you feel people want from a caregiver at the end of life?
I think, again, it's a question that is very unique to each individual, I would think, in some ways, but I think there's some common threads that we can see in terms of both as professional caregivers, but also as family members, as to what people are looking for. And just to, pick up on that issue of suffering, one of the most common associations that people have with suffering is a fear of being alone and a fear of abandonment. And I think for most people, I think it is the ability to have someone, or know that someone will be there with them, that they will not be alone. And so the biggest gift we can give to people at end of life is to be there, to show up, to not marginalize people as we often do in society when they're diagnosed with a terminal diagnosis. Often we tend to fear that part of that experience. We don't call. We stop sending the letters or the cards, or we don't come to visit. And I think that is a huge part of the suffering that people experience, in addition to the physical and other types of spiritual and emotional suffering. It is that loss of connection. Also that loss of meaning in life that people often feel, and loss of contributing in a way that they used to. And so it's trying to find ways to try and preserve that dignity, to try and ensure that people can feel like they still are worthy and valuable and have something to offer. In the place that I work, one of the questions we ask when a person is first admitted is we ask, what do we need to know as healthcare providers about you as a person, so that we can provide the best care possible? And the answers have been profound, but many of those answers are not about, well, look after my physical symptoms or make sure that, that I'm well cared for here. It's about, you need to know that I am a mother or I'm a father. You need to know that I was a teacher all of my life and I love to be around children. And you need to know that I've been a good citizen and a good person. And the stories, are varied from that, but it is that awareness of what it is that we need to be aware of to help preserve people's dignity till the very day they die. And that can range across a whole wide range of things to consider.
Thank you. Dr. Armstrong?
carry on with some of that would be the word continuity. And I recently was privileged to share in the last, well, I cared for somebody for more than 20 years, and she died a little bit earlier this year. And that I would go and do house calls for her, and she had that continuity, and seeing a different doctor every day as you might in the hospital setting doesn't do that because they don't know you. And so the compassion, the continuity, and time. If somebody's seeing a doctor and the doctor gives them 3 or 4 minutes and is out the door, they don't feel valued, there's no connection. So I think that people want a connection, and they want to be known for who they are and who they were, and caring.
Thank you. Reverend?
Well, when I am with people as they are dying, or even in the last weeks and months of their lives, they often want ritual, and so they're looking to me for the sacraments, so to have communion together with them, with their family, to receive Jesus in that way. They're looking for prayer, and often it's prayers that maybe they're far enough along that they can hardly talk, that they sleep most of the day. But when I begin to say familiar prayers from our liturgy, it is amazing the way people's eyes move or look, or they smile, or suddenly there's just a real awareness of the comfort. There's a section in our prayer book that talks about the comfortable words, and there are comfortable words that people look to me to be able to offer. Not that I'm the only one who can do it, but I'm often the one in the room with the book and the one who's been asked to do it, so I am able to, and I'm so honored to do that. So people look to me for ritual. People look to me for assurance of the fact that this isn't the end of their story. And so there's conversations around resurrection, around hope, around seeing loved ones that they haven't seen who have died before them. People look to me for ministry of presence, is what we would call it, which is the same idea of simply being present with people. And ministry of presence means showing up. It means, I remember a seminary professor saying to me once in class as we were learning about this, if you're wondering, should I go or should I not go, you should always go. Always. And I mean, I've remembered that for the last 15 years, and you just go. And it's never wrong to go. It's never been wrong in any of the times when I have just walked in the middle of the night to a hospital room, early in the morning, called somebody. And so just being present for what people need. And then people want to know that their loved ones are going to be okay. And so can you help so-and-so? Can you make sure to stay connected with my daughter in the days and weeks ahead? And they want a good funeral too, so they want to make sure that things that they liked were there at their funeral. They want to know their favorite hymns are there. They want to make sure the eulogy's not done by the guy they didn't like at the office. So there's all sorts of things that people want in end of life, and yeah, that's been my experience.
Thank you. Dr. Luke?
I kind of feel like I've wasted my luck in life now, because the odds of you being able to sit at a table with a doctor who does house calls in Canada, I don't want to estimate them, but I kind of feel like I should have bought lotto tickets, and now I've kind of wasted my luck. But it's still a great experience, that's for sure. I think if I could reflect on what's most important to people, patients especially, family members who are ill, what they want most in a caregiver, and this is coming from a person who works at a hospital where we take people's hearts out, put them back in, switch them with other people's hearts, give people mechanical body parts, keep them alive after they've been frozen, and all sorts of really extraordinary things. I find that patients in hospital, what they really want most is to know that the people who are taking care of them actually give a shit about them. And that lesson is emphasized and reiterated to me on a daily basis. And it is the same with personal relationships, and that you see a lot in home care. You see a lot of caregiver burnout, and that is a source of tension in and of itself. And a lot of people say, even people, you look at the literature surrounding assisted death, And in the Netherlands, for instance, over half of the people say they just don't want to be a burden to their family. They're not in irresolvable pain or anything like that. They just feel like they're a burden. And so I think getting back to the whole, question of being able to have that kind of emotional authenticity, that has to be nurtured to some extent. But when you are taking care of people that you actually really feel like caring for and you care about them, it's a completely different interaction than someone coming into your room and changing your sheets or tucking down your bed like if you were staying in a hotel, right? And people may smile the same way and they may interact with you in a pleasant way, but you really want those people to actually care about you. And you think about the ways in which we can facilitate that kind of authentic human interaction. And I think that's the thing that's really key. And really all of this discussion is how do we scratch our way down to that authentic experience of what it is to be sick, what it is to suffer, and what it is to take care of those people, and how we can become more mindful of that.
Thank you. And the final question is, what has working with the dying taught you about life?
Well, lots of lessons learned over the years. I'm going to share a few of them that have stood out for me, and one was actually from a lesson I learned from a young man in his mid-20s who was struggling with a cancer diagnosis, and got to a place where he was questioning, had a lot of questions around faith, around his spirituality and what was happening, and he got to a point finally of recognizing that perhaps there were some questions that there weren't answers for. And his exact words, or to paraphrase me, was, life is a mystery. There's some things in life we weren't meant to know. And it's always stuck with me, because I think we live in an age where we're looking for answers, and we want knowledge, and we want to know, and we want to have control over things in life. And I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that there are many things I don't know and will never have answers for, but hopefully that we'll never stop asking the questions, even though we can't have or find the answers. So it's embracing the mystery and magic of life, certainly is one lesson. The second lesson, I think, is around more around the whole idea of recognizing how life can change on a dime. How our lives, we go along pretty much day to day knowing that, we get up, we have our routine, and we know what we're going to do, and we think we're going to do the same thing the next day. And hopefully we will, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And so it's being able to do the things you've always wanted to do, and do them now, not to wait. And the third one is really around how we measure success. I think I went through school and had to learn a lot to get to the place where I am today in terms of my career. I have a lot of ways of measuring success, but the biggest measure of success for me has been my relationships. My relationship with my husband, Bill, who's been fundamental for me being able to continue in the work that I do, the special people who care about me and love me, and those are the things that mean most. As time goes on, the marks and the accomplishments and the awards, they really don't mean as much anymore as the relationships that I have.
Thank you. Dr. Armstrong?
I think what I've learned is that you don't have to be afraid of death. As I sometimes tell people, when we're born, the only thing you're guaranteed of is that someday you're going to die. Now, we don't know when that is. For most of us, we can't choose. Getting back to the previous question, that lady I was talking about, I walked the journey with her cancer. Was there when was with her when the cross told her that her chemo wasn't working, or actually she saw me and told me that she couldn't take the chemo and had to stop the chemo, and things had spread. And several months later, towards the end, I went to do a house call, and I saw her, and she turned to me and she said, "Am I dying?" And what she needed then, and what I told her was what I just told you now, that we're all dying one day at a time, but yes, you are dying. And with that, the next day, the priest came in, and the family told me that she led them in the prayers. And within 24 hours, she was gone. And when she came to that acceptance, it gave her permission. and peace. And she died at peace. And I hope that for all of us.
Thank you. Reverend?
When I saw this question, one of the things that immediately came to my mind is the importance of being in right relationship with people, especially with our families. That as I've walked with people who are dying or who have died, when they have complicated relationships with family members that never get resolved and there's a lack of forgiveness, the funeral and the grief is actually just a lot harder because there's so much more that you're grieving, the loss of a relationship that actually wasn't, or that you wanted to fix and couldn't or didn't. And so I've learned that we need to, as best as we can, continue to work towards being in good relationship with our family members. It's sometimes out of our control and we do what we can, but to be at peace with those that we love especially, and to seek forgiveness when necessary and to offer forgiveness when necessary in order to, at the end of life, and we don't know when it's going to be in right relationship with people. It makes the grief process a lot easier, I think. There's a verse in the Bible that says, "My times are in your hands, O Lord." And I think of it often, my times are in your hands, O Lord. And it would be my version of, we don't know how much longer, we don't know what will happen tomorrow. And so to just recognize the fragile nature of life. And so being with people who are dying has certainly taught me that as well.
Thank you. Dr. Lipp?
So it's lucky to be with doctors who do house calls, and then it's doubly lucky to be with doctors who do house calls and also tell their patients that they're dying. Because this is something we don't do often enough. People aren't honest enough about. So I don't think I'll be able to buy a lottery ticket ever again in my life or anything like that. My luck has run out. I think it's in the Hindu scriptures. There's a passage that I like that says something like, to the laborers we are entitled, but not the fruits thereof. And I think seeing the different situations that I'm involved with at the hospital I work at, one of the things that I've taken away is you can't take anything for granted, that you have a day or an hour or a year more of life, because it's demonstrated time and time again that that's not the case. And so we can't envision our lives, I think, according to these narratives, like the sort of police story where the cop buddy movie where one of the cops is about to retire and like building a boat, and you're like, oh, that guy's going to die, right?
Yeah.
You can tell automatically the odds are against him. And I think that attitude, that there is any sense of fairness or justice or deserts that we can expect to have some kind of payoff when we're retired or after we've gotten or finished our education or after we've gotten our jobs, to forsake the sort of day-by-day enjoyment of life and enjoyment of the people around you. I would hope that if there is any lesson that I've learned, it's that you need to enjoy the times that you're in, and not ever postpone any authentic human interaction, whether it's loving or dancing or fighting or the other things as well. That you can't expect to reap those experiences or rewards at some time by forsaking them in the time that you're in. So I guess that's, if there's anything that I've learned, it's to enjoy every day. Sometimes they're crappy days, but there's still things to enjoy in crappy days, and realize that if you don't take advantage of those, you're never owed any others. So that would be the lesson that I've learned.
Okay, well, thank you very much again to everyone for coming here today and for sharing your experiences and your wisdom with us. And thank you to everyone who came out to see the film and to stay through the panel and the Q&A. And this will be online in the next week at the website for the film, if you want to recommend it to anyone else to be able to see there. And thank you again, everyone. Thank you.